So we're starting a bit late, but you see that Professor Spence is so fast that he's just come from the other event faster than other people that we had to wait. Now, in this festival, we will speak about the euro crisis, and we will openly discuss, without any bias, without any prejudice, about the possible future prospects, being aware that remaining in this stalemate is probably the worst scenario possible. So we will discuss to which extent we should go on towards the economic and monetary union, thus giving up some prerogatives, or if we have to go backwards, and we will listen to very authoritative stances, for example, Jean Merlis, who will speak about the possibility of the exit from the euro. But now, speaking about this issue, that is the giving up of sovereignty and the future of the euro, we need to have an overall vision, an overall picture, because certainly this giving up of sovereignty has some implications. For example, the emergence of some emerging countries. And we couldn't but have someone like Mike Spence who will give us this overall picture. You will certainly remember Mike Spence, who was already with us 4 years ago, and who, on that occasion, anticipated the conclusions of the Commission on prospects and development. That was a very influential commission that he presided over for various years. And today, he will tell us about the future of Europe, starting from a global vision, a global viewpoint, and he will discuss the issue about the transfer of sovereignty, where we will have win-lose situations, or where we may have a situation where everybody wins. And above all, haven't we already lost some prerogatives, and nostalgia about the past is ill-posed. Mike Spence has the merit of being able to express very complex notions in a clear and easy way and simple way. Also thanks to the fact that he has a background which is different from a traditional background of an economist, because he took a degree in philosophy and mathematics. And he was one of the economists who was awarded the Nobel Prize when he was still young. And he's very dynamic, incredibly dynamic. He is very productive. When you look for him, the only way to reach him is to send an email message, and he will answer one day from Hong Kong, the other day from Berkeley, Chicago, London, Singapore. In just a few days, he trotters around the world. And again, he is very enthusiastic in communication. And he's very passionate also in his teaching activity. And our country is enjoying that because he is also lecturing at the Bocconi University. I don't want to take away any time from him.
Grazie, Tito. And thank you very much. It's a great thrill to be back at this festival. I think it's an extraordinary event. And this year, I think you're talking about a multidimensional set of issues that are of enormous concern to citizens of pretty much every country I've been in. So I think my role is to try to indicate to you something about this very rapid evolution in the sort of market structure of the global economy, and try to, in a relatively short time, at least give some hints as to what these pressures that we feel are. My sense of I'm no historian, but my sense of the evolution of over very long periods of time, like centuries, is that we are becoming more interconnected at a long distance, and our governance structures then adapt to that. And we happen to be at a point where we may be trying to figure out how to adapt our governance structures to match the way in which we interact with various people in the world. So let me launch into it. I'm going to sort of try to tell a story. But let me start. I wrote a book called The Next Convergence, based on my experience in the developing countries and a sense of their growing importance and their growth. Giuseppe Laterza was good enough to publish it and change the title to La Convergenza Inevitabile, which doesn't mean quite the same thing as the English version, but it's close. And I went around talking in America when the book was published to a lot of interested people, and the fear was palpable. And after I finished giving a few remarks on what I thought I was doing in this book, people said, the most common question is the thing on the top here, and it's, if they win, do we lose? And I think, in some sense, that is, at least on the economic dimensions, some of what people are worried about. I'm going to try to give part of an answer to that today. The answer is their growth is not coming at the expense of our growth. In fact, at some deep level, our interests are aligned. I spend a lot of time in China. If you ask Chinese, are the risks that we face mostly internal or mostly external, they would say usually external. And if you say, well, where is the biggest risk? They would say it's in Europe. Europe is China's largest market, external market. If you ask what would you most like to have happen, they would say a rapid restoring of growth and a stable, sustainable path in the European Union. They would say a similar thing about America. It's a little further along, but we've got a long way to go. This growth is going to make the global economy bigger, so it's not a zero-sum game, but those of us who thrive in that environment, the one I'm going to try to describe to you in a minute, are going to be people who adapt to a very rapidly evolving sort of market and global environment. And some of those pressures I think I can illustrate for you. I was at a conference recently in which the proposed topic was redrawing the map of the global economy. This is not a bad idea in principle, but I put it up here because what I want to convey to you today is that it's not basically conceptually the right way to think about it. A map is a static thing. And so the idea that you can redrop the map and then you know what's going on is, in this environment that's changing so quickly, likely to produce a map that's out of date within 5 years. If you go back 10 years ago, the Chinese economy was a relatively insignificant part of the global economy. Didn't have much impact on anything. People sort of noticed it because it was growing at a big rate. Now China is half the size of, the American economy or the European economy, is the growth engine for most of the developing world. That's in 10 years. So what I think, the way I urge you to think when you're trying to understand these things, is to try to understand the forces that are at work so that you not only understand what the global economy looks like now, but where it's going and what kinds of pressures it's putting on different kinds of people, which in the end is what we sort of care about. Now, you can't read this, so let me tell you, kind of my story. If you go back in the early part of the post-war period, we lived in a world that consisted of 15% of the world's population living in our countries, now called the advanced countries. We dominated the global economy. We were rather similar in economic structure. We interacted pretty effectively, especially with the architecture that was put in place after World War II. There wasn't a lot of complexity. When we had to coordinate, you know, I mean, I don't mean to oversimplify it, we were dealing, you know, with people in economies who had similar goals, similar patterns of behavior, similar governance structures, similar everything. And we got the job done. And that's not the world that we live in today. So the developing world at that time, in the old world, you know, was maybe 25 or 30% of the global economy. It consisted mostly of countries with per capita incomes well below $1,000. So they didn't buy anything interesting. Their presence in the tradable part of the global economy was minimal. Tradable just means goods and services that are traded. And that is exactly, you know, what's changing now. So that the developing world is 50% of the global economy. The large entities in it are growing at 6 and 7%. So we're going to live in a world for the second half of the century of convergence in which they become a larger and larger fraction, and they become more and more like us. And the issues that we deal with now, at least from an economic point of view, are this long transition where we've passed the point where they were relatively unimpactful on us, but we're well before the point, like decades, before we're all relatively similar as advanced countries. And it's this transition, you know, this interim period of 3 or 4 decades that's going to be so difficult for us. So here's the developing country share of the global economy. Even 10 years or 13 years ago, it was only 40%. Now it's 50. Within 10 or 15 years, it'll probably be 60%. And a lot of that depends on what happens in North America and Europe. Having said that, either 85% of the world's population lives in the developing countries. And so the fact that they're getting big in aggregate size and increasingly impactful on us doesn't mean they're rich. So these are the per capita incomes of a group of advanced countries, systemically important advanced countries, including Italia. And then you see the per capita income in the world on the right-hand side, still under $10,000 in purchasing power adjusted terms. If you look at the developing countries, and especially the ones that grew in East Asia, you see basically Japan that's made the full journey, that's like us. Hong Kong, Macau is basically an outlier because of gambling. Taiwan and South Korea are pretty much advanced economies now. ASEAN as a whole, that's South Asia, is way, way down still. And China is at about $6,000 of per capita income, even though the aggregate size of the economy is half the size of the American or the European ones. This is just to calibrate. So if you ask the question, when is China going to be as big as we are? The answer is somewhere around 10 years from now. We'll have one more partner to work with and try to organize sort of global things. If you ask, when is it going to have a per capita income that's sort of somewhere in the OECD, the advanced country range, we're talking, you know, probably 3 decades or more. So incomes and lifestyle and so on are different than mass. I just did this for entertainment. I was sitting in a meeting. What you have here is a picture of the size of various economies. So on the left-hand side, you have China. On the light blue lines are the BRICS, the other BRICS, Russia, Brazil, and India. And then I decided just to add Mexico and Indonesia as important high-growth economies. And if you add up everything to the left of China, you get the green bar, and it's a little larger than the Chinese economy by itself. And at the relative growth rates these are experiencing, even though some of these are high-growth countries. For example, Indonesia is growing at 6%, and so is Mexico. These are both major turnarounds. China will pass them in the near future. So that's the kind of world we live in. Now, what is it doing to us? Well, let me talk about some trends. I've already said that developing economies are more than half the global economy. A second really important trend has to do with technology and the way the global economy is stitched together. So the way I describe that is network structure is changing very rapidly, in part in response to these growing relative sizes of economies, and in part in response to the technological and managerial capability to stitch together global supply chains. So the way I've put it here is it's diversifying away from the major hubs in the advanced economies. I will show you pictures very briefly that illustrate these points. Third point is the global economy from the point of view of what interacts is the tradable part, okay? So I need to tell you something that then I'll use later on, which is if you look at an advanced economy, you will not find this in textbooks yet, by the way. If you look at an advanced economy like this one and ask yourself, what fraction of it consists of producing goods and services that are in principle tradable internationally, and what fraction produces things like government, education, healthcare, construction, and whatnot that are largely non-tradable? The answer to that question is an advanced economy, about a third of it is tradable, and about 2/3 is not. So if you look at the tradable side of the global economy, and that number differs a little bit for developing countries because they don't have big domestic economies. So the tradable part tends to get big pretty quickly when they start growing. So the tradable part of the global economy is basically shifting toward the emerging markets. And just to illustrate that, the most recent McKinsey Global Institute assessment of the middle income group in China, that's people with incomes over $3,000, is that it will go from the current number, 230 million out of a population of 1.3 billion, to 630 million in 10 years. 630 million is larger than the population of the European Union and twice the population of the United States. So just so you calibrate, you know, this is sort of like standing in front of a tsunami. Now, this is not a bad thing. In fact, this may be one of the most important opportunities in terms of growth in our future. So I don't want you to misinterpret it, but it would be very hard to ignore this development in sort of thinking about global trends. Advanced economies, I'm afraid I have to say, are in somewhere between low and, for a short period, at least in Europe, negative growth. And we don't know how long that will last. You will spend a fair amount of time talking about that in the course of this festival and the political and economic structures that go with it. Just for what it's worth, I'll give you my assessment. The American economy is recovering. It's further along than the European economy. It's by far not at full potential, and it won't get there until the government stops underinvesting, and that's going to take a while. On the European side, you have the complexity of a structure that probably won't be a durable structure in the long run without alteration. And I think it's fair to say that we will have negative growth for the next year or two, and then a difficult recovery, even if the downside risks that we all know about don't materialize. Sovereign credit risk, meaning the credit risk on sovereign debt in the world used to be entirely in the developing world. Nobody ever, up until the last decade, considered that an advanced country's sovereign debt had any significant credit risk in it. Now it's reversed. Most of the credit risk is somewhere in the advanced country group. If you'd asked me, as a middle-aged economist 20 years ago, I'm pretty old now, if I'd ever see that, the answer is no. The global supply chains are atomizing, which means they are becoming more complex and split into smaller and smaller parts. And that has two effects, both of which are of first-order importance in terms of the way we feel. One is it expands the global economy's tradable sector. Why? Because things that weren't traded before were sometimes not traded because it was too expensive to put them somewhere else. That is, if you have some competitive operation here in northern Italy, then you used to have a whole bunch of stuff around it that was there mainly because it was too expensive to run the operation by putting it in Indonesia. Well, the costs of putting it in Indonesia or India, or somewhere in Eastern Europe have just gone down a whole lot. And that's a combination of technology and management, learning, and expertise. And so we are seeing the atomization of these global supply chains expand the tradable sector. The other thing we see in global supply chains is the image you will have, that the East made things and we consumed them, that most of the markets were in the West. Used to be true. It isn't true any longer. These global supply chains run from more or less everywhere to everywhere. And the way to think about global supply chains is that they go to the place where they naturally fit in terms of, comparative advantage, almost without any friction. So the only way to retain something in these global supply chains is to actually be competitive in them. One ancillary consequence of that is that if you look at these chains, and I'll show you a picture in a second, what you discover is that the import content of exports is growing in virtually every economy. Finally, on the advanced country side, if I have time, I'll show you the graphs very quickly because I'm sort of summarizing what I want to try to communicate to you. This is where I think our challenges come. We have short-run growth challenges. They're more severe in Europe. But underlying that, we have issues that have been developing over at least a 2-decade period. And I've tried to list them here. First, technology is taking routine jobs out of the economy, not to another part of the global economy, just out. This is called, ATMs. This is called the automation of information processing and transactions. It's in the manufacturing sector, it's robotics and now 3D printing and whatnot. This is pretty well documented by research that was started by economists at MIT. And these are not only blue-collar, but white-collar jobs. So they call them manual and cognitive. But if they're routine, they're in the process of being reduced or eliminated in these economies. And that is one of the reasons why, when you look carefully at the data, growth and employment aren't following the same paths. If you take the American economy in the last 3 recessions, 91, 2000, 2001, and now, what you will see is an increasing divergence between the growth recovery of the economy and the way employment behaves afterwards. So the notion that if we restore growth, we'll restore employment is something that is probably increasingly not true as we go forward. And this same set of forces, technological and global integration, is causing 2 other things. One is that the tradable sectors in the economies that I've looked at carefully, which is the United States, the Italian economy, and the German economy, the tradable side is growing reasonably, but it's not generating really any employment. And in fact, in the Italian case, as best we can tell, the employment's been going down in the tradable sector. And the pre-tax income distributions are shifting in an adverse direction. That is, income is going to capital in the global economy and to high-end human capital. Those are the folks that think globalization's just terrific, right? In the middle income ranges, at least on a pre-tax basis, and countries do very different jobs about redistributing income and or essential services for sure. But in the middle income range, incomes have been much more muted in terms of growth. So the distributions are going funny. So let me illustrate some of these things that I've said. So this is the share of the tradable part of the global economy, or more precisely, world exports relative to production. You can see there's a pretty steady upward trend. This is the global economy, in effect, trading with itself increasingly over time, and there's no reason to expect these trends to reverse. The little dips you see are things like the Great Recession, for example. This is a picture that was put together by researchers at the IMF, as a number of these other graphs were. I referenced it on the previous one. This is the current network structure of the global economy. You don't want to try to track around a bunch of orange lines, but the idea is pretty simple, and that is there's a number of developing countries in this, and China has become a very significant hub, along with the major systemically important If you looked at this graph 15 or 20 years ago, it wouldn't look anything like this. It would be completely dominated by the advanced countries. This is a picture of what's happening to export shares in the global economy. And again, you don't want to spend a lot of time on this, so I'll just tell you, if you go black, green, red, you're going forward in time. So what you'll discover is that the advanced countries are declining. They're not unimportant, but they're declining importance in sort of in international trade. And the big upswings, again, I don't want to belabor the point, but the huge one, upswing is China. China is the largest trading nation in the world at the moment. You'll notice the China one doesn't have a black graph or a black line on it. But in 1970, China was invisible, interacted zero with the rest of the global economy. It didn't start to interact until 1978. If you look at this, we see that one of the reasons that the developing countries have become less dependent on us is they're not reliant entirely on our demand, our markets. They are big markets in themselves, with China at the hub. So if China falters, then it'll slow down pretty much everybody in the developing world. So what you see here is that there's essentially three blocks in the global economy now. There's NAFTA, that's the North American one, and there's European Union, you know, in its large version. And then there's an emerging bloc which trades a lot with itself. And I could expand this to the developing world, which is East Asia, including China. If you look at trade that goes across those blocks as opposed to within them, then what you see is a pattern of increasing trade within the blocks. And again, these are all correlated statements. Basically, what you're seeing is the developing countries becoming larger, trading with each other, becoming less dependent on us and more resilient. And by the way, all of that is good. We don't want them dependent on us. You know, we would like to see what we've actually seen in the post-crisis period, which is pretty resilient growth, not impervious. The European downturn has actually slowed these folks down because it's such a big, important market, and the downturn is now sufficiently dramatic as to actually cut into them. But what's new is the developing world can generate enough aggregate demand to support its growth in a way that wouldn't have been true even 10 years ago. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but the mix of world manufacturing exports is changing. It used to be very heavily textiles and apparel, in part because that's the way most developing countries enter the manufacturing side of the global economy, and that is not small, but it's declining in importance relative to rather more sophisticated products. This is associated with these economies moving up what is sometimes called the value-added chain, and the process, the long-term process that's underway, is they're becoming more like us. They have a long way to go, but they're becoming more like us. They move into sectors that are closer to what our economies do in this new atomized tradable sector world. And now here we have the atomization of the global supply chain. So this is for 4 countries. It's a picture of the import content of exports. That's the little colored things. And while they're not huge yet, they're not trivial. So if you look at the German case on the right of the screen, you can see that if you take the exports of Germany and ask what fraction of those exports were essentially imported and incorporated in the products, the answer is 27 or something percent and rising. Whereas if you go back a number of years, I mean, this doesn't go back very far, the old model that we produce things in one country and produce them in, and sell them in another, and that's trade, is increasingly not true. There's lots of examples of this that have been well studied. So if you take any Apple product like the iPod or the iPhone, we know exactly where the value is created. So a chunk of it's created in the United States, in Silicon Valley, with sort of design and kind of marketing and stuff. And then the computer chips come from Taiwan and South Korea and Japan, and the displays come from one of those, or probably South Korea, and the parts show up in China and get assembled in a company called Foxconn. Well, the amount of value added that's added in China is not trivial, but it's not all that large as a fraction of the total. And yet when we look at exports, we see most of the Apple exports, whether they're headed for Europe or America or wherever else in the world, they seem to be coming out of China. And that's a major data problem. So this shift in the way global supply chains are structured means that the way we account for trade is no longer very useful, because it gives a completely misleading picture of what's actually happening. And so you find the World Bank, the WTO, the OECD, and a number of others have to have major project on redoing trade data in value-added terms. It's not easy to do, but it's important if we're going to get a picture of what this economy around us looks like. I'm going to skip over some of these things because I've already said it. In the advanced countries, I think we're in for a tough period. And I say this somewhat more bluntly when I'm speaking with the press, because I think there's an issue in our political and policy discussions, which is, I think people still think that when you have a set of structural and leverage, debt type problems of this type, there's some way to fix it quickly. And there isn't. And so part of the problem is the expectations are out of line with the reality. There is no way, even if you set aside the structural issues in the Eurozone. In America, we have a pretty flexible economy. The private sector is doing most of the heavy lifting. The deleveraging is fairly far along, but there's lots of things that are keeping us off potential. So let me skip ahead to one or two other things I wanted to just mention to you. This will seem like a non sequitur, and you may talk about this more at the festival, but growth isn't a bad measure of how things are going up to a point, but there's a limit. And specifically, growth doesn't account for the distributional changes. And it certainly doesn't account, the conventional measure of growth doesn't account for whatever we're doing to the sustainability of our growth model. What this is a picture of the rate of growth of income in Brazil divided into the 10 deciles of the income distribution. Now, if you know anything about Brazil, you know that they lost 2 decades from 1975 to 1995 and then got things together, and they've started growing, and they've had their ups and downs. You know, so growth has been impressive at times, 5 to 6%. It's down a bit now. You might say struggling along, certainly systemically important country at 200 million people, kind of the anchor of the Latin American economies. But what this says is something really important, which is the high growth is occurring at the low income levels. So what they're doing, the Latin American countries are the countries with the widest, most uneven income distributions in the world. There are historical reasons for that. I mean, to exaggerate slightly, 3 people owned all the assets, at the end of the kind of colonial period, and that tends to persist. What Brazil has engineered is something that's socially really important as well as economically, and that is an inclusive pattern of growth. A pattern of growth in which the income distributions are sort of coming, the measures of income inequality are coming down. And that means higher growth at the bottom and lower growth up at the top. It's pretty impressive performance, but it means the growth figure doesn't tell you what you need to know. This is a complete aside, but Brazil's problem is that their investment rate's too low. So a developing country that wants to grow at 6 and 7% has to invest well over 25% of GDP to sustain that growth. That's not a theoretical conclusion, that's sort of an empirical generalization. The Chinese investment rate's 45% of GDP. That is 45% of the Chinese GDP every year is not consumed, but invested in generating future growth. Now, Nobody thinks that number has to be quite that high, and there may be some inefficiency in that. But growth, from an intergenerational point of view, it's important. Growth requires investment of one kind or another. And if I had one thing to leave you with today is whether it's developing countries that aren't doing so well or advanced countries that sort of lost the thread along the way, one of the things we've done is stopped investing, especially on the public sector side, at high enough levels to sustain the growth. I mean, it's worse than that. We not only stopped investing, but in many cases, we moved aggregate demand, consumption in particular, and investment to some extent, which we weren't willing to pay for, from the future to the present using debt. And I guess a flamboyant way of describing this, but for the sake of generating some controversy, that's an appalling intergenerational choice. And if we keep it up, our children and grandchildren will not forgive us for this, because it will leave them with burdens that they never should have had. Finally, let me talk about the advanced countries very quickly. So this is the thing I said before I never thought I'd see. So on the lines that are going up are the advanced countries. All of them, that's the red dotted line, and the G20 countries. This is the sovereign debt to GDP ratio. So we're trending up toward 100% as a group. The developing countries, including the lowest income and the poorest of them, are trending down to 40%. Now, many of you may not have thought about this very much, but if you thought about it and asked yourself the question, would you ever see that in your lifetime, that the richest countries in the world would be borrowing and borrowing and borrowing at the public sector level, and the poorest countries in the world would be bringing those debt levels down? I guess my answer is I never thought I'd see that. And this is part of the trouble that we're now in. I like this graph. I'm not sure the data are totally accurate, but there's sovereign debt and then there's debt. And I show you this just for the sake of your future discussions this week. The Italian economy is not out of line in terms of aggregate debt. It's similar to France and the US and whatnot. What's different is the composition. The two outliers in the world when it comes to sovereign debt, which is the black part of these things, are Japan, with an unbelievable 220% debt to GDP ratio, and then a distant second, Italy, at 120%. And everybody else is lower. But Japan's out of line in total debt, and so is the UK. And the Italian economy is not. That means basically that there's more resilience here than people think when they think only about sovereign debt. Now, that doesn't mean it's easy to use the resources. Why is Italy so low, by the way? This is something probably everybody in this room already knows, which is the household sector is not heavily indebted. It's not only that, it's wealthy, because this is a high saving, on balance, relatively speaking, a high saving country. But these debt levels are too high, and in the context of the European structure, they are threatening. That is, this is what I call, I think Olivier Blanchard at the IMF, a friend of ours, described this world as sort of replete with multiple equilibrium structures, and that's true. And the Eurozone is a classic multiple equilibrium structure, where one equilibrium is that, the yields stay down and the sovereign debt eventually comes down and the growth comes back. That's the good one. The bad one is that the external investors who are already nervous are kind of busy staying on the sidelines or exiting. And then you get a run up in the yields that undoes however much austerity you think you ought to have, and kills the process of restoring growth. And eventually the citizens say there must be a better structure and a different game to play, and then it'll be chaotic beyond belief if it ever happens. And I don't think it's the most likely outcome, but that's the second equilibrium. And the reason we are in the middle right now in what my friends at PIMCO call a stable disequilibrium. And the reason we're there is that we have the policy circuit breakers that keep us there, which is the the ECB with the German backing that was talked about in the first session on the one hand, and fairly strong commitments from important countries like Italy and Spain to not only get the fiscal house in order, but restore sustainable patterns of growth and employment. Finally, this is a picture that I took from data from the United States. So this is a long period of time. This is the growth or the pattern of the GDP. And what you can see, and this is just to reinforce the point that we live in a relatively different world. What you can see is that the trend line is, in this last recession, we're not anywhere near back on the trend line. In fact, we're not even close. And if you take a sort of shorter look at it, it looks like this. So our growth is coming back after a tremendous shock, but it's not coming back the way it used to come back, you know, so that we got back on the trend line, which is about a 3% rate of growth. We're well below it. And nobody really completely understands why we're down there or whether we're eventually going to head back to the trend line. I have my doubts. But for sure, I think we're not heading back in terms of employment. So on the lower right, I think, is GDP, and that's coming back. So on the American side, we're above where we were after a tremendous hit and a pretty long lag. On the employment side, we're sort of coming back, but we're not really close. And we're not growing anywhere near fast enough to absorb the incremental labor force. So our youth unemployment problem is not as big as the one here or even worse in Spain, but it's not trivial for sure. This is what I told you before, so it just illustrates. The bottom is the routine jobs. And you can see after the 2000-2001 recession, a just precipitous drop in these jobs as technology kicked in and started taking them out of the economy. And when you add the fact that the same technology that allows you to do this also is the technology that knits the global supply chains together and allows you to move jobs all over the global economy, I think you have a sense of the pressures that we feel in our economies, but especially in the middle class, you know, where many of these blue and white collar jobs resided. We know some of what we need to do to respond to this, and it has to do with maximizing, you know, the provision of skills and appropriate human capital and education to people. What we don't know is how much of the challenge that we face we'll solve by doing that. And finally, the tradable and non-tradable sectors. So this is some research that I did and then we're continuing. And so we basically took these economies apart as best we could. It's not a clean data exercise, and asked where were jobs created over the last 20 years in these economies. The United States, you know, created an awful lot of jobs. This number, by the way, used to be bigger. If you go back before 2008, the number was 26 or 7 million. So we're down to 21 increment. That's a pretty big hit. So you'll see similar things in Europe. So this is post-crisis up to 2010. And you can see that the tradable sector is a negligible contributor to employment. I'll leave these behind, so I'm not going to say this, but for those of you who are interested, this sector by sector is where the jobs were created and subtracted. The blue is tradable and the red is non-tradable. The big lines in this graph are government, construction, and healthcare. Most people think construction was a boom that was not going to last. Most people think the government's gotten too big, and most people think we spend too much in America on health care. So if you take away those employment engines, you haven't got much left. I mean, it's pretty clear we have a problem. This is value added. I apologize for the nerdy term, but value added as opposed to output has the virtue, if you add it up across sectors, you end up with the GDP. I apologize. Value added behaves normally. So the value added in the tradable sector is actually growing slightly faster than the non-tradable. It's not as big because the non-tradable side is such a big part of the economy. And so if you look at value added per person employed, it's essentially flatlined on the non-tradable side, and then rising extremely rapidly, especially after 2000. Remember, that's when we started taking non-routine jobs out of the economy, and globalization took this rapid turn and accelerated. Basically what's happening is that the jobs are either being, the middle class routine jobs, white and blue collar, are being taken out of the economy or moved offshore, in the tradable side of the economy especially. So what's left is these very high value-added things, usually associated with people who are highly educated and so on. And there's nothing wrong with this from a growth point of view. There is something wrong with it as a pattern from an employment point of view. This is the Italian economy. If I had Germany, I'd show it to you, but it's similar. This is just the fact that the Italian economy is smaller and hasn't grown, but the tradable sector appears to us to have declined. I'm not so sure of the accuracy of this data that I want you to sort of take these numbers literally, but I think the pattern's pretty clear. And you see the same thing in the German economy. The reason I think these three are interesting is the United States is whatever it is, and the Italian economy has clearly got a growth problem as well as an employment problem, and the Germans had major reforms, and yet, and is relatively speaking doing pretty well, especially on the tradable side, although it's running a rather large current account surplus, which isn't helping with aggregate demand. But you see the same pattern in all these economies. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, so this isn't a function of where we were and what kind of shock we absorbed. These are long-term underlying forces that we're dealing with. So that's value added in the Italian economy and so on. Same graph, tradable and non-tradable. The divergence you saw in America is not occurring in the Italian economy, and it's much more muted in the German economy. So that's an element of difference rather than commonality. Finally, this data is notorious, Tito would agree with this, notoriously difficult to collect on a comparable basis across countries. But the OECD made an attempt to figure out how much of national income in the OECD, read advanced countries, went to labor. Now the problem is, you have services delivered to labor and, health and other things. It's just a nightmare to kind of sort it all out. But as best they could tell, for about 30 years after World War II, the fraction of what went to labor was going up. And then it reversed quite suddenly, and it appears to be going down. What that means is there's only two other places for income to go. One is capital, meaning businesses and the people who own them, and the other one's government. And I don't think government's changed that much, which means that the way the global economy is configured, more and more income is going to capital, and I would include that in that high-end human capital. Why is that? I mean, at the most basic level, we created a structure that allowed several 100 million people to enter the global labor markets, and they probably had an effect on the price of labor. And it may be, although the details get more complicated, that simple. I'll skip over this and simply conclude. I think the multi-speed world that we're living in, developing countries, North America now recovering, fairly long period of slow growth in Europe is here for some time. I think the convergence pattern that we're seeing, the developing countries eventually joining us, will continue. I think we have enormous challenges adapting our institutions to this evolving pattern of kind of global interaction. It's not impossible. I don't want to leave you with the feeling. I think the German reforms that were undertaken remember in 2000, the German economy was described on the cover of The Economist magazine as the sick man of Europe. It had ingested East Germany at an exchange rate of 1-to-1, had enormous productivity differentials, and they were in trouble. They were in trouble in terms of employment, growth, competitiveness, and labor market flexibility. And they went after it. What it took is, first of all, it cost Gerhard Schroeder his job, so this is not politically popular stuff to do. And secondly, they had to get business and labor and the public sector on board. And specifically, if you're going to have labor market flexibility, and they had enormous labor market inflexibility. You couldn't close a plant. You couldn't move stuff easily to Eastern Europe where it belonged. You couldn't do all the things that you'd expect would happen in a global economy. It was a significant part of the trouble. But they didn't go to labor and say we need flexibility. They went to labor and said, if we get flexibility, we promise you growth. We will share the restrained income growth across the spectrum, and we will rebuild the social safety net, so that the social safety net that was embedded in the fact that we couldn't eliminate your job, your plant, your company, and replace it with something else focused on people. And I think we need the same thing here. We can't do these things one by one. It's got to be a deal, I think. If we do that, if we manage to get that kind of process done in a number of countries, then actually we may not solve all the problem, but we will solve a fair amount of it, notwithstanding the fairly rapidly changing world we live in. And in terms of sovereignty, I'm not an expert on sovereignty, but I would say a couple of things. One, I think there's a clear permanent loss of sovereignty in the sense of, at the national level, controlling your own destiny. I can't think of any practical way of isolating yourself from these forces. You can cut yourself off from financial flows. You can cut yourself off from knowledge flows. That would be a very dumb idea. You can cut yourself off from trade flows and try to protect particular markets. But you can't prevent your people from going somewhere else. So if you kind of create an environment that isn't very interesting, then the human capital will move, because there's lots of interesting places in the world for it to go. So when I try to think it through, I just don't think there's any way to do that. You may modulate the transitions, you know, by sort of intervening in certain ways, but by and large, I think we're living in a world in which the sovereignty loss is permanent, and we have to learn to live with it. And the second thing is we live in a world that's very volatile, because the economic interdependence isn't matched, even close to matched, by the governance structures that surround it. So this, relative to an older period when we had relatively homogeneous advanced countries working collaboratively with each other in a global economy that they dominated, this one is relatively unregulated and volatile, and probably as a result scary to people. You know, my children and grandchildren, you know, if we solve some of these problems on the transitions and deal effectively with the sustainability issues, I think are going to be in a world with an even more complicated governance structure. You know, if most people in the Middle Ages lived in or around a manor, and somewhere in the 19th century we got nation states, I think we're in a natural evolution. We live in multiple places. We live in cities, we live in provinces, we live in countries. Our identity evolves and is associated with all those things. I don't see any future that doesn't have multinational governance structures, and that's why the European experiment, it's by far the most experiment being conducted in the world. So if you who live here permanently, unlike me, solve these problems, then the rest of us will clap and follow you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Michael. This was really fascinating, and it was just what we need, because we were saying that we need a global picture to frame also our discussions at the festival. You went so effectively, but clearly fast, over such a number of very important facts that if I can, complement one thing that you said, because for the sake of clarity, on the, of this labor share data. The labor share, this is something related to the functional distribution of income. It's not related to the personal distribution of income. It is also possible that some of the workers are shareholders themselves, and so therefore this decline in incomes may not be so close to the evolution of the incomes of the workers themselves. And talking about data, there is a factual thing that was coming to my mind by looking at your very nice slides, and this is you were clearly pointing out all the measurement problems related to the unbundling or the global supply chain in measuring what is tradable, but there is also a serious problem in measuring service, the trade in services, which is, so I wonder whether part of the decline in the tradable sector in the advanced economy has to do with the fact that there is a lot going on in services. But also a broader issue related to finance. If you talk to employers in Europe right now, employers tend to tell you that the issue is not really trade, is not competition right now. The problem they face is not competition from developing countries. The problem is credit squeeze. They can't get access to credit. And I kind of start thinking that the current crisis, as well as the previous one, is basically a banking or a financial crisis. Was not a housing crisis. It's true. It started in the subprime market. This crisis started in the debt in Greece, but it's now a banking crisis. So I wonder whether, your story is telling us that basically what is really preventing Europe to go back, because it's, also we are more distant from trend growth than the other continents, is the fact that we need to reallocate a lot to be able to grow. And given that we are in the middle of such a bad banking crisis, this reallocation cannot take place because banks are not there to finance this reallocation that badly needs banks to be done. But before, these are just a question that were coming to mind. I'm sure you have, ci sono domande dal pubblico.
Are there any questions from the audience? I would like to entertain questions from the audience. The idea is that it's the audience, it's the people.
We just get some questions from the floor. Per cui, prego, brevi, sì.
This gentleman should use the microphone. I'm sorry, but the gentleman is not using the microphone, so the interpreters cannot translate. Thank you very much. Well, growth and employment didn't go hand in hand for a long time. Second, not investing means betraying younger generations. Indeed, they cried, but we didn't listen to them. I'm a priest and a small man. Thank you. We have a question down there.
You talk about sustainable growth and China. So I think that China is going to a big problem right now because it's struggling to grow, but there is an over investment rate. So global economy is getting smaller for China. And since China is going to play a big role in the future, what do you think China will do in the future to overcome this problem? Thank you very much.
Un'altra domanda e poi lasciamo...
We'll entertain another question and then we'll have the answers.
Can you hear? Okay.
Perhaps if you stand up, perhaps it's better so that everybody can see you. Yes.
It's a pleasure to be sharing the same space with you once again. As you mentioned, the developing countries need to have investment level to GDP ratio of at least 25% if they need to, look at some decent prospect of growth in the future. But then again, these countries are plagued by different problems, especially relating to revenue mobilization, domestic revenue mobilization, and a lot of other problems dealing with debt servicing or structural flaws and all of that. So when the odds are stacked so highly against investment to the levels that you mentioned, how do you expect that to, go through? And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thank you. So maybe we start with this. Is it okay with you?
Well,
Michael,
thank
or you
you.
want to take another one?
No, it's fine. I'll forget. At my age, you tend to forget.
Come on.
Thank you for the comment. I think we're in the process of rectifying this kind of intertemporal pattern. On China, you know, I spent a lot of time there, tried to be helpful in formulating, among other things, the 12th five-year plan, which is the current operating game plan for reform in China. I threatened Tito with talking about China, and he said, no way. So you will find, if you get a hold of these slides, that the whole last 20 of them deal with China's structural change. And it's complicated, but basically, this is an economy that has to significantly change its growth model to stay growing. It's an export and investment-led growth model that has almost outlived its useful life. And so the shift that's coming, other than big structural changes on the supply side, so you associate China with relatively labor-intensive manufacturing or assembly, process-oriented manufacturing, that's all going to disappear in the next 5 years. If it doesn't disappear, you'll know there's something wrong. It will slow them down. Now, they could do it. They could keep it. You know, sit on the exchange rate, subsidize it. You know, there's 150 ways to make a mistake. So that's one. The big interesting change is, for me, somebody who spends a lot of time thinking about growth, is on the demand side of the economy. So the Chinese economy has a declining ratio of household income to total income. It's actually under 60%, a household savings rate of 30%, and most people think consumption, the hypothetical future partial driver of growth in the economy, is under 40%. Now, if you look at any one of our economies, and you know, it'll be 65 or 70%. So this isn't just going to do it. And this means transferring income, and by one channel or another, from the corporate sector, from state-owned enterprises and government, to the household sector, so their share is bigger, and then changing the growth model to domestic aggregate demand, which includes investment, and they have to screen out the low return investment, which is what they're getting from using the investment growth driver. They just keep investing and investing. This is a system that was built to invest on autopilot. That's why it's 45% of GDP. And if they don't stop it about now, then they'll start to make low return investments, and then that growth model runs out of gas. I mean, you can see why. Investment works because it makes things bigger later on, but if it's low return, it doesn't. Okay, so that's a kind of snapshot. This is an extraordinarily complex transition. It's called the middle income transition. Most developing economies that enter the middle income transition at about $4,000 to $5,000 of per capita income either slow down or stop. And there's only 5 exceptions. Japan, when it was a developing country, Korea, Taiwan, and the city-states, Hong Kong and Singapore. And nobody's tried it at China's scale or complexity. Having said that, you know, I spent a fair amount of time there, and I think they know what they're doing, so I'm optimistic. There's all kinds of risks. They could screw it up. I don't think the risk that they don't understand what they're doing is very high, but that's a personal judgment, having spent time there. The risk that a big vested interest, like the state-owned enterprises, gets in the way of crucial reforms, competition, driving innovation, a whole bunch of things like that. That could easily, I mean, the state-owned enterprises, you know, are a major focus of high-level corruption. And if people get angry enough about that, they'll kind of blow the lid off. The answer to the last question is, I think, fairly simple. There isn't really anything you can do in a developing country from outside that solves the, you know, the sort of political and or structural impediments. They have to be solved from within, and that's because people don't like, even when they're in trouble, they don't like outside interference. It's a lesson I learned when I did the Growth Commission work that Tito referred to. And so there's a number of countries that that have some fairly hard work to do to get dysfunctional things out of the way. I mean, many of us are very attached to democracy, but there are many, many democracies that have developed pathologies, you know, where people buy votes or use their control over resources to either steal them or, or control via power and violence. And there's lots of examples of that. So those are the thing that you can do from the outside to help. Once things start to go well, whether it's because of crisis that finally turns things around or whatever, you can swing in behind it. And when the international institutions in the advanced countries are doing well, that's part of what they're doing. And I think increasingly you'll see developing countries do that. China's become a pretty major controversial investor in Africa, for example, but I don't want to minimize the problem. On the other hand, the pattern of high and rising growth in the developing world is pretty widespread by now. I mean, things you think of as really problematic are much less problematic now. There's a new generation of leaders in many African countries. Africa's growing at about 6%. I mean, this is stuff that doesn't correspond sort of with the old image.
Thank you very much. Last two questions and then I think we...
Io, siccome...
Now, in my opinion, emerging economies are not working so well. So my idea is that we should move from a profit-based economy to an economy where people do not take advantage or exploit other people. I saw that Russia has 77% debt. Europe is about 300, but 77 is far from 300. I don't know if we should look at Russia as an example. Thank you. I have a question. Well, it's me who decides. Okay, a very short question. I'd like to know if it is appropriate to speak about loss of sovereignty, also of the market, not only loss of sovereignty by governments, because markets play a role. So I think that it would be appropriate for the market to give more sovereignty to governments, if we understood the question. Now, you made reference to the public debt of Italy and Japan. Now, our sovereignty is something that we share with other European countries. Don't you think that at a certain point we could have a situation where the public debt is restructured or repealed? I realize that it is a bit strange, but couldn't we think about such a situation? Well, a very demanding question, very difficult one.
I'm curious what keeps down the United States potential to be maximized.
Okay, so I'm going to be brief because people have other things to go to. Russia has not got itself untracked. It is a potentially high-growth country with an enormous amount of talent and a ton of natural resources, but it's a very, very difficult and somewhat dangerous place to do business. And so numerous companies and financial institutions have gone there and exited. So basically, they'll probably solve this problem, but they haven't solved it yet. You know, on the loss of sovereignty to markets, maybe this is going to sound excessively harsh, but basically when you borrow money, people expect you to pay it back. If you don't want to be dependent on markets, don't borrow the money. Okay? Or borrow an amount that you can be sure you're paying it back, and then the markets won't do anything to you. The markets are doing stuff to us now because we borrowed so much money that they're starting to wonder if we're going to pay it back. I'm oversimplifying a little bit, but the lesson is not to get mad at markets, but to sort of structure one sort of way forward in the world in such a way that, markets don't get control of important things. And in the current context, that means less leverage. By the way, I agree with Tito's earlier point. There, especially in Europe, the financial distress in the banking and financial system is causing constraints on growth. So basically, you can constrain growth by absence of demand. That's the main issue in America. There's a bit of credit constraint, but it's mostly demand. You do it by not getting credit where it's really needed as opposed to where it's sort of excessive. That's clearly true in many parts of Europe. And then you can do it by failures of productivity growth, which not only drives long-term growth, but competitiveness on the tradable side. So all three are relevant. I think I may have understated the issue here in Italy and in the Eurozone. On the public debt, I think, you're basically right. But we cannot, at this point, issue European debt and sort of, socialize this whole thing because we can't solve the burden sharing problem. So first we're going to have to stabilize it and get people on a path where they're not contributing too little growth and too much debt to the mix. And once we get there, then I think, the natural evolution of this structure in the direction of more Europe and less divergence. Let me say one thing that, probably will cause some controversy. The reason this is a flawed structure is because almost everything that I've learned to think about is relevant from a policy point of view in terms of growth, public sector investment, labor market policies, tax systems, openness of the economy, etc., is decentralized in Europe, except for the currency. So then you wake up one morning and you discover countries have taken different directions in terms of productivity and whatnot. And then you ask, well, how does that normally cause and get adjusted for? Well, part of it is sort of what we're seeing going on now, but the other part is inflation, that's not allowed, and exchange rate adjustment, and that's out of the question, right? So this is a system that looks to me to be designed to produce divergence that then gets to be a problem because the adjustment mechanisms aren't there. And my feeling is, Europeans who are going to decide this thing basically have to choose between more centralization or this amount of decentralization that really matters, combined with more effective adjustment mechanisms. I wouldn't presume to suggest which is the best way to go. What was the last question?
It was more on the U.S., right?
Oh, yeah. It's basically so here, the American economy story is fairly simple. There's a lot of problems that you see elsewhere we don't have. For example, we don't have inflexible labor markets, for example. So the capital markets are deep. Capital and labor moves around fairly quickly. The recovery you're seeing is basically a combination of deleveraging, which has gone fairly fast, a housing recovery, and private sector structural adjustment, including more competitiveness on the tradable side. And eventually, the demand shortage will diminish. So what's left? What's left is excessive healthcare expenditures, huge non-debt liabilities in the entitlements area. This is the word we use for things like Social Security and healthcare and whatnot, and underinvestment. I mean, the infrastructure for a person like me, an American, when I compare the infrastructure in Los Angeles or New York to the infrastructure in China, in Beijing, say the airport, I'm embarrassed. I mean, how can we be out-invested by, and the same is true of human capital and skills development and other things. So until a combination of people and especially government overcome the pattern of underinvestment, we'll be below potential because there's no way around it. So that's my short answer to that.
Grazie mille. Nella risposta ci ha dato una verità davvero molto importante.
Thank you. You answered with a real truth, which tells a lot also for our future meetings. The fact that in Europe we are in a situation where policies that really matter for growth are carried out by single countries, and which entails the fact that in the end countries grow in a different way. But countries do not have those tools which can help them overcome the problems. And this is a way to define the current problems of Europe. And if you look at data, well, if you look at growth levels, growth rates, you will see that European countries have different growth rates. Trentino is better off than Sicily, for example. But in terms of growth rates, there is a difference depending on the country. The growth rate in Italy is low, not only in the south, but also in the north of Italy. So we thank Michael very much for his introduction to the festival. There couldn't be a better one. He worked a lot on this event. He prepared many other slides that are on the site, on the website of the festival. You can download them. Thank you.
Was that okay?